Welcome to CSM Talk, the CSM podcast that focuses on two fundamental aspects of customer success: value to the customer and value to your organization. Today on Rule 40 Success, I'll be asking my guest to focus on a particular area of the Rule 40: new logo acquisition, upsell and expansion, churn or profitability, and give their point of view on how they would partner with customer success to drive aspects of the Rule 40 and how this delivers customer value. Okay, got it? Good. Let's CSM talk. All right, welcome to CSM Talk Rule 40. And today I have on the podcast my guest, Greg Daines. So Greg, please introduce yourself.
Thanks for having me. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm at the moment a consultant and CEO of a company called Churn Rx. Our focus is entirely on driving down churn and building robust growth for companies, and we do that by looking, deeply into your churn data and designing strategies for the kind of churn that you have, and so that's where I get my kicks and what we do, and we work with companies, mostly recurring revenue companies, but my background is more I was a founder CEO for many years, and just discovered that the one common challenge that just seems to never go away, that's fundamental to all these businesses, is how do we make customers successful at scale consistently? And so that's what I decided to focus on, and that's why I'm doing what I do.
Excellent. So before we start and get into the Rule of 40, I always ask everybody an icebreaker question. So the icebreaker question is: sum up in one word, not 10 words, 3 words, not even 0 words, but in one word, sum up customer success.
Okay, I have it. It's results.
I like it a lot. Cool. So when you obviously work with businesses to look at, how they're doing business and making recommendations of how they can reduce churn. So do you want to just talk us through who you partner with in businesses and how you partner with businesses to look at churn?
Yeah, well, nobody would disagree with the statement that churn is the net outcome of all of the functions of the business, right? And so that's not shocking, but it's also not very helpful because it doesn't make it clear what everybody's role is. So the first thing I want to say is, one thing we've learned, we do a lot of research. We have this huge benchmark database, millions of records, customer records. And what we've been able to do is to unpack something that I think is really important, which is there isn't just churn, there's different kinds of churn, okay? And so the first thing we do is we find out what kind of churn you have. Well, there's only 3 kinds, actually: early churn, mid churn, and late churn. Now that may seem overly simplistic, but actually this ties back to my one-word answer for customer success, which is results. It turns out that customers churn for essentially a single reason across the lifespan, but they have different points of failure. So essentially customers, our data is very compelling on this. They don't leave because they're unhappy. They don't leave for a lot of the reasons we sort of traditionally thought that they left: negative experiences, et cetera, actually are associated with longer customer life, not shorter. So they leave when they essentially get to the point where they perceive that they're not going to achieve their business results, okay? So that can happen either early, which we define roughly as the first year, mid, which is more or less the second year, roughly, and then late, which is after that. Okay, so which kind of churn? It turns out, well, you think, well, we've got all kinds of churn. Actually, that's an illusion based on the way we measure churn, because we use churn rates and we lump all our customers together instead of saying how many of customers, right? What share of customers left in the first year, second year, and after that. And it turns out that when we look at companies, they'll have a dominant type of churn. It'll be early, mid, or late. And the vast majority of companies, actually, it's early. The vast majority of SaaS B2B companies, which is our focus, something like 85% of companies have a dominantly early churn type. And what that means is that when you look at, and the best way to look at this is the way we do, which is using cohort analysis. When you look at a cohort of customers, what percent of them left in the first year versus second year versus third year? Now, you still lose customers in those other phases, but if you have the dominant type of churn that we look at most often, early churn, right? The amount of churn tends to go down to a pretty low level after the first year. In some cases it doesn't, but in most cases it does. Okay, so that means typically what we're partnering with our clients to do, Kevin, is look at their early churn. And by the way, it's a huge benefit to know what kind of churn you have. So if you have early churn, just as an example, but this applies to late churn as well, it means that you don't have to look at all the possible causes, right? You can actually focus on just a few. Why? Because the reasons customers leave early are very different than the reasons they leave late. Customers leave early essentially because they never got to first value. They never got to that momentum driving value realization moment, right? And we know our data shows that actually measuring the customer's business results is a critical factor. Customers who measure their results stay 6 times longer than those who don't. Okay, so then that tells us if we're focused on, so we first identify that type, we focus on early churn as an example, then we don't have to look at all we can really focus, if we want to move the needle on churn, which is huge, rule of 40, you cannot grow if you're consistently churning too many customers. We can really focus just on the drivers of early churn. And what are those? Well, they're just a couple of things, because it's only the factors that essentially prevent a customer from getting to that first realization of measured value, measured results, okay? So, well, how many things can be like that? Well, let's just list them off. One is they're a bad fit, right? Some customers don't get to results because they can't. So I want to be clear about what I mean by bad fit, because it's a squishy, it can be, a little bit nebulous, but let's just be clear. In my definition, a bad fit customer is a customer who can't win. Not who won't, or is uninclined to, or is really bad at it, or didn't think it through well enough. These are customers who have the wrong use case, or they lack some of the key essential ingredients for winning. They don't have related systems, or they don't have the ability even to start. So you think, well, gosh, that can't be very much churn. Oh, but I beg to differ, and we have data on that. So, well, that's one. The other one is, well, they were a fit, but we, for whatever reason, couldn't get them to first value. It largely has to do with onboarding. Okay. Honestly, beyond that, there's not much more. Now, there's a lot in those, but what it means is we can really contain our scope of what we need to focus on. So if you have early churn, and there's a 85% chance, if you're listening to this, your company has that type of churn, then you really can focus in. So you asked about how do I partner with groups across the organization. Well, in the case of the sort of dominant type of churn that we see across the industry, we're looking at the whole front end, not just onboarding. We're looking at how we market, how we message, how do we even find good fit customers? How do we sell them? And it turns out there's a ton of things there, including, right, in addition to the sort of the onboarding experience. And this is a really big deal, right? There's a lot going on there.
Right. Okay. So if I hear this correctly, some of the things that are key to looking at bringing, mitigating early churn is firstly having that first point of value and understanding what it is and how you can measure it. And secondly, are they even capable of winning? Are they even capable of seeing value?
Exactly right. Because here's the thing. If they can't achieve value, that's different than they won't, then they should never have been sold in the first place. That's not a problem I can solve in onboarding, right? There's nothing we can do on the customer success side to solve that. So we have to look at that. And I said, very frequently people will say, well, gosh, how much can that really be? Well, the answers on this is astonishing, actually, when we unpack that. And so after we sort of work out your dominant type of churn, there are a number of things we can use to determine how significant the selling bad fit customers is. And so we've done a lot of that. And what we found is that it's pretty significant. Actually, it's surprising. So I often say we buy more churn than we make. Now, this, of course, it's a bold statement, but I'm absolutely serious about it. And of course, I'm obviously referring to companies that have that dominant early churn mode. And in many cases, I would say most of those cases, but not all, there's a significant contribution to that severe early churn problem from just selling to customers who can't win. And that could be a use case problem. It could be a resources problem. There's lots of things. So one example, let's just look at use case. A lot of companies will build this brilliant technology and it works really well in the space it was designed for. And then they, take on venture capital and private equity, and they have this intense pressure to grow. And so what they start to do inevitably is to say, well, here's another use case that's very similar. And our solution could fit that use case. And here's another one. And so I call that opening up the aperture. So they open up the aperture to get more sales in. Well, it's not that they're completely wrong in many cases that other use case couldn't get some value. But here's the interesting thing. If you say we're to take the top 5 or 3 or whatever use cases for any solution, you could probably rank them. If you can't, then you probably should do some work. But I think most people could probably rank them in order of how much value that use case can get from your solution, right? And you could have, so there'd be a number 1, a number 2, number 3. Very frequently, the number 1 is the one they started with, but not always. But anyway, there's one kind of clear winner. Now, let's say it's true. You get 100 points of value for the first one and 80 points for the second one and 65 for the third one, something like that. Well, they're still getting value, right? But what we find is when you rank those use cases in terms of churn, there's significant increases in churn outside that, what we call the bullseye use case. And so it isn't that no one can win in those other use cases, but you have to take it pretty seriously whether you want to sell additional churn by adding this additional use case. And maybe churn stays low enough that you can get away with it, but maybe not. And you have to, and very few companies kind of separate those out and look at those clearly. And when we've had the data to do that, largely, by the way, because very few companies track the use case exactly, right? Sometimes it's visible in the solution they buy or whatever, or the industry they come from. But most of the time they're not tracking that. But when they do, what we find is churn will always go up every time the company expands its aperture to another use case. So this is where I say that's still a fit issue. Right? And the question is, if you have too much churn already, then you already can't afford more. You already can't buy more churn, right, by expanding your aperture. Does that make sense?
So what I'd like to clarify, just for the purposes of people listening in on this, is when we say use case, now in my mind, use cases can mean a couple of things. They could be a process use case, saying, I've got this. I mean, look, here's a really good example. You've got people like Asana and Monday, where you can essentially do anything with it. But they may have like process use cases, which go, I have a CRM use case. I have a project management use case. I have a product development use case. So those are kind of use cases in terms of process ones. Yeah. But other use cases might be, people might go verticals. I have a use case where I've got the best billing solution for automotive OEMs, right? It's built for that. It's built for that reseller channel type thing.
Right.
Are those the two things you're kind of meaning in terms of use cases? Process and maybe industry vertical?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have evidence that both of those have this effect. So let's do the process one first. We see this all the time, but one example is a client of ours was in the sort of business intelligence, BI dashboards, and right, you can use it to do anything, right? But when we broke down their use cases, it turned out that one use case, which didn't stand out otherwise, was far and away the highest retention, and that was the marketing space. Using it for marketing, measurement, et cetera. No one had immediately a clear answer as to why that was the case, but it was very consistent in their data. So what did they do? They built out a branded marketing version of their universal Swiss Army knife technology, and it did really, really well. There were certain use cases that were so bad that they almost wanted to figure out how they could stop letting people buy it for that reason. And you can use, marketing messaging and methodologies and where you get leads, et cetera, to solve for this. So you really do need to think about that's the process version. But obviously you see the same thing in sort of like the vertical, like the business case, right? And the same, and it, in some ways it's even more obvious there because frankly, if you can stack rank those, who can make, this is an interesting way I think of the question. Who can make the most money from our solution, or who can get the most measurable result if it's not money? By the way, if it's not money, I'm wondering what it is, but let's just say it's not. Who gets the most, then who gets the second most? People say, we don't need to do that. Yeah, you do. If you have too much churn. Now, if you have really low churn, this is all kind of an academic exercise. And zero churn's not a real idea. So we just need churn to be low enough that it doesn't get in the way of growth. Back to rule of 40, right? So, okay. So there are companies, we see them that have extra low churn. They're fewer than you think, by the way. And so if you are thinking about churn, chances are you have too much. And if you have too much churn, you have to look at this as one of the factors. This fits into that umbrella where I say we buy more churn than we make, right? Because it's just a fact that there is not an even distribution. Like your technology, whatever your solution service offering is, it doesn't equally apply to everyone, right? And so obviously that's true. So how do we think through, how do we measure correctly the differences so that we can understand? Now, one of the answers is you may just want to stop selling to someone, right? And particularly, that would be true to the degree that you can't change your technology very rapidly, which is mostly the case, right? I can't get a whole new solution tomorrow. But in the long run, you can look at those use cases that are just adjacent to yours that might have juicy TAMs, big markets, and you could say, well, what can we do to the product to make it perfect for that, to add value to that use case? That's a completely valid answer too. What isn't valid is to pretend for some reason that there's no difference and there's no value in thinking through how different target segments that we're bringing in are performing in terms of long-term retention and success. There's bigger differences than people will admit, and that's one of the things that we look at. So, in a number of cases where we determine you have early churn, we can pull out, well, part of that's because, you're selling to segments that can't win. So, decide either to drop them or to figure out how to help them or to build a product for them, but you got to do something about that, right? So that's a whole pre-sale kind of experience. And frankly, when we've pulled apart all of the factors that we've seen, there are 20 some odd factors. I actually published an ebook about this. 16 of them are pre-sale of the factors that drive significant churn. So more than all of the rest of the factors, once a customer is closed and sort of the post-closing journey, vastly more of the factors occur before they even close, right? Who they are, how they fit, what expectations have been driven, how they were set up for failure or success, how they were engaged, what commitments they made, all that stuff. There's a lot there. Anyway, you can go, I have this ebook on my website called 23 Ways to Reduce Churn. And it's astonishing. And the data is in there. We actually include the data on what we know, how each of those factors, how significant they are. So we do have to partner. If you really want to drive churn down, in vast majority of cases, you have to heavily involve the whole front end for marketing and sales and product, and not just assume we can dump anyone in and onboarding can solve for what's missing. No, actually. And increasingly at the moment, companies are discovering that's a super expensive way to do it that doesn't produce a lot of results, right? So
this is all really good stuff. What I'd like to just discuss to sort of wrap this all up is, if you're a CS leader and you're on the leadership team, you're there around the table with sales, with marketing, with the GM for your region or whatever, with product, with professional services. What physically would you want to bring to the table to say, these are the refinements we are suggesting from what we see that should be fed into the front end process and the go to market? What are the kind of the high level things I'd take into a board meeting.
Yeah. Well, it's really hard to have this conversation with those people without data to validate that there are meaningful differences in the group. So you've got to do your homework on that. We have a method for doing that. That's what ChurnRx does. But you can do this even without that. You have to break that down, which means you have to track use cases and you have to track factors, big versus small companies and various factors that relate to who are we bringing in. And then you can bring that table and say, hey, look, there are big differences. Okay, that's one thing you need. The other thing you need is, if results are everything and getting customers to their first result radically reduces churn, right, by a massive degree, even if it's a small result, then the other thing I need to show people is the results. Because marketing's interesting, right? I like working with marketing, because they're wired to think in terms of selling benefits rather than selling features. But very frequently they're stuck selling features because that's what the company feeds them. Here's what our thing does. Here's why it's better, right? So the other thing you can bring, which is extraordinarily valuable, is what results do our customers care about? And one reason we don't have this locked in is because we spend so much time studying failed customers. We send out surveys and we ask, why did you leave us? You can't learn anything from those. I'm sorry, those are not effective. It doesn't work. That's like calling everyone you know who failed in life and asking them, what they did wrong. That's not how you get to success. What we need to do is study successful customers. And when you do that, what you discover is there's a consistent and relatively small number of key business results they care about, the ones that are compelling enough to keep renewing and even expanding. When we've consolidated clarity around what those business results are, and even to the point of how they're measured, and we feed that up into marketing, marketing's typical answer is, thank you. Where has this been? All we've been getting is a steady diet of feature, right? Feature. Now you're telling us what our target customers care about. So if they create messaging around the results that matter, and usually there's just a few, maybe 1 or 2, sometimes 3, it's not 10, it's not 5. Those core things allow them to create messaging that actually attracts the customer we wanted in the first place. We don't have to, it's not about filtering out the bad ones usually. It's mostly about, is our marketing clear enough that the people who need us really know they've found the right place? That's critical. So that's the other thing. And the way I recommend doing that is what we call a customer results framework. Customer results framework is, have we clearly articulated internally, and no one's in a better position to do this than CS. The interviews that product management do with customers and potential customers are not going to produce this insight. What results matter to the customers who are very successful, keep swearing they'll renew, but this is super valuable to the business. What's the result in business terms? How's it measured? And this is the big one, what did they have to do to achieve it? So that you can load a framing in that brings people in for the right reasons. Then sales knows what to focus on that matters most to them, so they can close them faster and for higher dollars, but also for the right reason. So we're on the same page with sales. And then do the most important thing, which is right then, when they've got the customer the most motivated and energized around this business result, tell them what they'll have to do to win. Because at that moment, customers will say, yes, I'll do that. Then when we get them into onboarding, it's like, okay, here's your win, clearly articulated. You know what you're going to have to do. We're going to help you do that. And then we can hold customers accountable. They're committed to do the right things, because the difference between customers who get results and those who don't is that the customers who get results are the ones who change how they work to take advantage of the way your solution produces benefits. So that's, once they're closed, everything's about, can we get them to change their behavior? And you can see how this whole setup allows us to do that. So we've fed into their 2 things. Number 1, who are we going after and for what reasons, right? What's the driving motivation? And number 2, what behaviors do they have to commit to that will lead them to success? It makes onboarding a lot more effortless. Now, in order to do that, we also have to do that last thing, which is to clearly articulate not just what our key results are, but what customers who are successful did to get there. And again, it's not 10 things. It's usually 1 or 2 things, maybe 3. So this is why CS is in such a special place. It's in a position to discern all of that and clarify all of that. I don't think we've gone enough typically into those meetings you're talking about with all of that, the data lockdown, the clear results identified and consolidated, and then clarity around how customers win. If you load that into your go-to-market engine, it produces powerful improvements in retention. And it's not that we don't have improvements we can make in onboarding. We absolutely do, but they're really driven around that being set up in the right way.
And yet again, this all comes back down to essentially, well, the heart of CS, which is the value realization program. You know, what was the value proposition you bought this for? Here's the program we put in place that actually post onboarding, make sure you deliver on that. This is how we measure that success of you achieving that value proposition and the value back to you. And that's what we can feed back into go to market.
Right. Exactly.
It's so simple. Why is no one else?
Well, everything we just said has a clarity to it that should resonate with people. But make no mistake, there's a lot of work implied in what we do. I mean, this is why we exist, because companies frequently need help interviewing their successful customers in the right way. That's something we do. Pulling out the key insights, looking at the data in the right way, separating it so that the net of that is a clear story about what we're really for, which means who we're for, why we exist, how we, produce that result, and then how we materialize it back to customers. Make no mistake, there's a lot of work in that. And frankly, it's hard. And that's one of the reasons, so few companies have gone through all that. But there is a methodology. There is a method to the madness. There's clarity, at least as to what's going on, so that we can go attack it in the right way. And thankfully, having done it enough times, I have a sense as to here are the exact steps you can go through where you can do in a matter of months all of that and be much better aligned as an organization and much better aligned with your bullseye market. Perfect.
Greg, this has been amazing. If people want to get in touch with you, is LinkedIn the best way of doing that?
LinkedIn's great. Also my website, which is just gregdaines.com. All my resources are there, all my downloadables. There's a ton of things on there. So go check that out. My newsletters, subscribe to that if you like some of this stuff and want to see our research. It's all on there. So that's probably also as good. If you're curious about ChurnRx, you can go to ChurnRx.com and look at our analytics, churn analytics solution there as well.
Cool. Basically, for anyone listening to the podcast or anyone watching on YouTube, we'll have these as links against the episode, so you can click on there and get the resources. Awesome. This has been amazing. So, Greg, for the viewers out there, you might actually have been over to England, or you are coming over to England, depending on when this comes out.
Yeah.
But at some point I'm going to see you over in the UK. That's going to be great. So look forward to seeing you. And thank you so much for being a guest on CSM Talk.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Kevin.